All right, welcome back. Like we said, I'm going to bring Jack Lazarus into the studio here. Jack, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Jack, my boss, just kind of, I got hyped up a
I'm
little bit.
not rude
You know,
now.
Daily Emerald sports editor. He's going to be at this game. Jack, we're gonna start breaking this down. Dan Lanning was talking. You were at this press conference. He said something to the effect like, "I hope who we are on Saturday is nowhere near our best." What do you take from that?
I think that's very in line with what Dan Lanning's always said and how he's always kind of acted towards the team and improvement. So basically, he's always been the kind of guy like every week we got to go 1-0. Every week we got to improve. Every day we got to improve something. And he said to me, he said, when I asked him, what does it mean to be back coaching? Like, what does it feel to be finally back coaching in football games? And he says, well, it's exciting that the season started, but I love practice. He loves practice. He loves getting to work. He loves improving, and he likes seeing his team improve. So it's more just the same from what I've seen from Dan Lanning, like usual stuff.
And I mean, to
Yes,
be honest, you guys, like Oregon was nowhere near its best in Week 1 last season. Is that trying to like kind of set expectations reasonably, or do you expect Oregon to come out of the gate and throw them under the bus like they did Portland State a couple years ago?
I don't really think it's much to do with expectations because again, this is just his mindset. I think they know that they're expected to come out. They know what happened to them last year. A lot of these players are returning. I think what will happen is this pressure will kind of come up at the beginning of the game. And I think maybe for a couple of drives, you won't see that much happening because of how nervy the game might be, especially against Montana State, who's a great FCS team, just like Idaho was last year. So I think more or less that the team knows its expectation, and I think they'll play like it for a little bit, but then just kind of settle into being the superior team.
Jack, I'm just curious to know, as someone who's been there throughout fall camp, what's the energy been like around the team, and have you been able to kind of pick up on anything that you feel like is going to be present there in week one, just in terms of the little pieces that you get when you actually are on the boots on the ground in Eugene?
I think a lot of what the team as a whole has been preaching is that last year wasn't good enough, even though they were undefeated, even though Oregon made the Big Ten championship, won the Big Ten championship, made the Rose Bowl, and all that. Like that's not good enough for them, especially for Dan Lanning and his coordinators and most of every coach that's been interviewed is kind of along the same track that last year wasn't good enough. Every day, every minute, they need to improve. And I think that's created a lot of excitement around fall camp because I think they're ready to get to work. They're ready to actually start being dominant again. And I think that starts with Montana State. That starts with Oklahoma State, two teams that the Ducks are probably going to be expected to win by like pretty big margins.
I think they're
So I think
a four touchdown favorite this weekend.
exactly, yeah. And
Yeah, I think it's like a
while
29 and a half or something.
I don't know if that's going to be the ending scoreline, just given it being so early in the season. But I think that the whole expectation is that they're going to go out and dominate, and that's what they're like itching to dominate. That's what kind of the vibe has been.
Yeah.
I
All
think
right.
that just kind of speaks to the what Dan Lanning has done to this program, where a 13-1 season, where you go undefeated in the regular season, win a conference championship, that's not enough, and that they're seeking bigger goals, or seeking a national championship, and despite the fact that you did go undefeated last season in the regular season, they didn't come out the way they wanted to. They started this year ranked number 3 in the country, and then had a bit of a dud against Idaho. A closer game against a team that turned out to be better than people expected in Boise State, but they fall down to number 9 in the rankings, and they know that that's not good enough, and they want to come out and kind of prove that they are at that level and should be considered as a top 10, top 5 team in the country.
Awesome. John, real quick, is going to take us through a couple of the notable camp battles. We still haven't seen a depth chart. I know some of these programs are dropping depth charts. We've seen one, I believe, from Montana State. Ducks haven't. Like we said, they haven't announced starting quarterback. They haven't announced starting anybody. We picked out a couple ones that John's just going to run us through real quick. We got corner, wide receiver, and safety. Who do you see starting there?
All right, so quarterback, I think Theron Johnson should be out there at quarterback. Jack, I'm curious to hear your opinions on all of these as well. As a guy who with experience in the Big Ten, brought him in as a transfer, I think he's probably going to be out there. And then the other guy I have listed right now as a starter, Ifeoma Badegu. He's going to be a redshirt freshman this year, but just has been getting phenomenal hype throughout camp. Everybody has been coaches, players, everybody has been talking about the guy he has become, and I think it was interesting to hear this week in the kind of like the documentary series they did, and people talking about how he was able to utilize a year where he wasn't on the field and still be able to get better. So I think that's going to be interesting to see. Really good athlete out there at corner, and I think he's going to be kind of a bit of a surprise to see out there at starting when you have some older guys behind him. But I think Dan Lanning is going to want to put his most talented players on the field. I think Ifeoma Badegu is going to be one of those guys this season.
Yeah, I also think that Obadegu is just, he's been there for a year, that they like the experience. That's why they're going to start Johnson. And I think Obadegu, he's been there and he's gotten better. I think I've heard a lot of great things about him.
Yeah, I think.
This is a secondary that's losing a lot of guys, right? So you're going to try to rely on the experience that you do have. That's a great point from Jack. That just, while they are losing guys who've gone to league or who've graduated, it doesn't mean that there's not experience and guys who understand how to play in Tosh's defense and in Dan's defense.
And I wouldn't be surprised to see Jaleel Florence rotate in there pretty heavily, a guy who was a starter for this team 2 years ago, and then a pretty severe knee injury, missed all of last season. It's going to be getting back to, I think he said that he feels like he's back at 100%, but it's different when you're on the field. You feel like your knees at 100%, but you got to really be able to trust your body and trust that you're going to be able to do all those things correctly. We've seen the Ducks before. They rotated corners a little bit last year, more than we've seen in other years, bringing Dante Manning in to supplement Nico Reed sometimes and Jabbar Muhammad at times. So I think he could be a guy that gets some run as a third guy. And then Sione Laulea, really talented. I think he'll probably be that cornerback 4 in that room.
Yeah. All right. What do we got out wide, other side?
All right. On the other side of the ball, I think Oregon, they've talked a lot about how this year isn't going to be just, we have these receivers, we're going to be out there in 11 personnel the whole time. I think this year you're going to see a lot more 12 and 21 personnel from this team, even some 13 personnel, getting those extra tight ends and running backs out there. But I think the starting group for me, I would have DeCorian Moore at the X receiver, big time playmaker, true freshman, but expect to be one of the most explosive players on this team. I think they're going to trust Gary Bryant out there in the slot. Just because of the experience that he had, was the number 4 receiver for this team a couple of years ago. A really experienced guy, has the experience from USC. And then Justice Lowe, I think we've seen him rotate a little bit between the slot and the Z, kind of playing that off the ball other outside receiver last year, between Tez Johnson being out, Trayshawn Holden getting suspended for a game. I think they kind of move him out to the Z and kind of just trust him there because he knows the offense. They trust him to block and kind of do those things that you want your receivers to do. Other guys I expect to rotate in a little bit. Malik Benson, I think he'll be the number 4 for this team. And then we'll see where Kyler Casper kind of fits into things. A guy who's been hyped up as a top prospect, but hasn't really put it on the field yet. Big playmaker downfield, can be a vertical threat for Dante Moore. But I think those 3 are the guy I expect to see out there the most. And I think Malik Benson will be a guy that can rotate out there, stretch the field, and just use his speed. And another guy, experienced guy with time at Alabama and Florida State.
Absolutely.
I've heard a lot about Malik Benson. Yeah, I've heard a lot about Malik Benson just like coming through camp. I think that he should be available and ready to produce at a higher level than a lot of people expect, actually.
I think a lot of people were talking about how much of a locker room presence he is too already. He's the guy who transferred in this year, but had already taken some wide receivers kind of under his wing. It just seems like a good guy to have in there, like John said, even if he isn't starting. Just the kind of guy you want to have in your room, especially with a guy like DeCorian Moore, true freshman, starting out at X, which I think is something he could do. We've seen multiple freshmen do it and be wildly successful. I don't think that's anything, not to put that expectation on him, but I think it's absolutely something they can do, and we should expect to see him starting in this offense.
I think there's just going to be more rotation in general throughout the receivers. I think when you are getting into different personnel groupings and different looks like that, you're going to get a little more rotation and just to kind of keep guys fresh. And when you don't have necessarily a guy like Tez Johnson, who you trust to be out there every single down, not saying you don't trust these other guys, but you don't want to take a guy like Tez Johnson off the field. So I think there's just going to be a little bit more rotation throughout that group overall.
Yeah, like we mentioned, Ducks brought in a couple big time transfers this offseason. One of them was Dylan Thieneman, safety out of Purdue, junior, I believe. So we got one safety spot nailed down. He's going to be the starter. Who do we feel like is going to sit next to him? Because there's a couple guys who really feel like they could take that role.
Yeah, Jack, I'm definitely interested to see or hear what you have to say about this because it's kind of an interesting situation where you've got three guys in Kingston Lopa, Aaron Flowers, and Peyton Woodyard who are all top like 4-star recruits in the same class. So I think it's gonna be interesting to see which the kind of those guys emerge. Kingston Lopa is the name I've seen the most attached to that other starting safety spot. Just in terms of the size that he has, what he can do out there. Dan Lanning talked about him being a receiver in high school and just utilizing that size to play the ball, be able to disrupt things. I think he can come downhill and hit people in the box as well. I really like Aaron Flowers. Aaron Flowers was really good in the spring game. Was good in the spring game as a true freshman as well last year. I think he would be interesting next to Thieneman because you could put Thieneman up high, run him as like a single high or run that too deep and stuff, and then bring Aaron Flowers down in the box. I think he would be a really good option down there. I think Woodyard is kind of third out of those guys just because he plays this position more similar to Thieneman. But curious to hear what you think about those guys and who you think can emerge, Jack.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be Lopa. I think it's going to be Lopa because, I mean, you mentioned that you could always put Tiedemann. He's a great player. You can always put him in a, one high kind of situation. And they mentioned that, there could be some situation where they move Lopa down like right behind the front seven and just kind of in that roaming position where he can come down and hit people in the box. And Coach Lanning, the other day, he mentioned that what he's really excited to see is that the defensive back room has gotten longer. They're like bigger guys, and Lopa's 6'5". Like, I think that's why I think he'll get a lot of clock because there's guys like Johnson, guys like Sione Lalea who are bigger guys and can add a lot to this cornerback room or safety room because I think that was a lot of the issue last season was that these corners were a little bit too short and were getting exposed in towards the end of the season. So I think that that's why I think Lopa will end up becoming the guy right next to Tiedemann or even kind of in front of him in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the other really interesting thing to talk about is how many guys have kind of converted between safety and linebacker in this team. Jeff Bossett was one of them. So it's not unfamiliar to bring a guy from safety and Betcher down into the box. If Lopa was to do that, it would not be out of the new at all.
Yeah, he doesn't quite have the frame that those other guys do. He's a bit just longer and skinnier. So it would be interesting to see how he would put on that weight to move in a linebacker. But I think obviously at 6'5", he's definitely a guy you feel like has that kind of size. Some other names to throw out there, Jaden Kennedy, just because he's a guy he played safety at Ole Miss last year. They used him in the slot at nickel in the spring game. We're gonna have to see who's out there between him and Dalen Austin. Dalen Austin's the other guy out there. Austin provides you a little bit more of a big nickel who can kind of play the run a little better. But Kennedy, a really talented guy who has starting experience in the SEC. I wouldn't be surprised to see him play the nickel, maybe even play some high safety. He can move things around, and I think Dan Lane is going to want to just get him on the field because he's an experienced guy that he feels like he can trust.
Awesome. Well, we know a little bit more now about who's going to be starting on the Duck side of the ball. We don't know that much about the Bobcats. That's why we brought Jack in, a little bit from John. They just named their quarterback, Justin Lamson. He's a true junior, transfer from Stanford. He has played Oregon, played him in 2023, lost 42-6, had 106 passing yards. The really interesting thing to talk about, though, is he's a real running threat. And that's something that this Montana State team is really strong at. It was the number 2 rushing offense in the FCS last year. Number 1 no, was it number 1 yards per game? Yes, number 1 yards.
I have to imagine they were 1,200. They were over 1,200 yards more than the number 2 team in the FCS last year. Just ridiculous numbers in terms of the rushing from them.
And so that is a really interesting thing for these Ducks to deal with right off the bat because we talked about how important the defensive line is in rushing the passer this year and how much we feel like they could even maybe lead the Big Ten. For them to have to stop the run early, what does that mean?
Well, I think they're gonna. Well, Bryce Betcher kind of mentioned it today, actually, that the stopping the run kind of now has 2 folds to it because of Justin Lamson. But it's kind of abetted by the fact that Bryce Betcher has seen him, he's played him. But the defending them is now a 2-fold thing, especially for the front seven, who's almost all new. And it'll be very they're going to have a lot of pressure on them, just getting hats to balls, making sure that Lamson doesn't get out. And if Lamson gets out, it kind of breaks the whole game plan. And it creates a situation where it's okay, now we got to move a linebacker over. We got to shade him this way. And I think Bryce Betcher kind of colored it in very well by saying, I have to watch a lot more film this week. I have to lock in. And a lot of that was because he's like the strong side linebacker. He's going to have to follow Lamson on a lot of plays. And I think now that they're still kind of like using the run as their kind of their dagger. So they're going to kind of keep going. And I think, like the linebacker core and the pretty much new defensive front, like they're going to have a lot of pressure on them. And I don't think that's going to bode well for a little bit, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think discipline is going to be the key to success in the run game for the Ducks, because in those quarterback run-based, option-based offenses, it's all about fooling the defense again, the bite on something so that you can get your quarterback out in space and get him outside. As a defense, you should have everybody marked up in terms of the run game. You have, who's going to follow the quarterback, who's going to be the pitch guy, who's going to do all that. It's about staying disciplined and not falling for those tricks in the run game, and, being able to make sure your linebackers are not just watching the ball, but watching everything to make sure they know what's going on. Like you said, it's a talented run team, and from Montana State, their quarterback last year ran over 1,000 yards. They're bringing back 1,000-yard rusher at running back. It's going to be a little bit of a test in terms of just not necessarily the talent on the field, but can you stop a scheme like this that wants to run the ball down your throat?
Yeah. Especially because that's going to look a lot like that Penn State team that has two really successful running backs you're going to have to face early this season. I think if they prove that they have a really strong scheme, like you mentioned, that can deal with this and diagnose it without having to make all-star plays, that's going to bode really well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, this is going to be a great test for the Penn State game. Like, this is a very similar offense. But for what it's worth, MSU, they replaced both their coordinators, and how much film is the coaching staff really going to get of Colorado School of the Mines? So it's going to be very new, and especially with a different quarterback, like there's a lot of unpredictability, which I think I agree with John. Like, it's going to be very important to stay disciplined for these guys.
I don't know about you. I watched every CSU game last year.
That's all you, man.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting. Last time the Ducks faced, a really strong running quarterback was Damon Williams, and we saw how that went. I'm curious to see how their offensive line holds up. Obviously, we expected to be relatively strong from a team that led that FCS in yards per attempt. John, I think you had something about their D-line. I mean, they're bringing back really important guys. That's always something that you have to look at, especially for a guy like Dante Moore, who we've been talking about, is a guy we want to see be really comfortable in the pocket. Could these guys wreck that?
Yeah, the defensive line, I don't know if they can necessarily wreck that, but this is definitely the strongest unit on that side of the ball for Montana State. Their new defensive coordinator, Sean Howe, was the defensive line coach the last couple of years, so it's a guy who has been building this defensive line. And then you got a pair of guys in Paul Broughton and then Kenneth Eden, who were all Big Sky picks last year and are projected to be were preseason All-Americans for the FCS this season. So you got a guy Brought who's 300 pounds, the only 300-pounder on this defensive line, but it is providing more of a test than you would see from some other FCS schools, than probably from Eastern Washington or Portland State or whoever. So, yeah. And like we said, Montana State's ranked number 2 in the FCS right now. They are a team that is year in and year out in the playoffs. It's a team you can't take lightly and can't overlook, or else you do end up in a situation like Idaho last year.